The country of Georgia was part of the Russian Empire from 1801 to 1918. Throughout the early modern period, the Muslim Ottoman and Persian empires had fought over various fragmented Georgian kingdoms and principalities. By the 18th century, Russia emerged as the new imperial power in the region. Since Russia was an Orthodox Christian state like Georgia, the Georgians increasingly sought Russian help. In 1783, the leading Georgian kingdom became a Russian protectorate and abjured any dependence on its suzerain Persia. But in an unintended chain of events, in 1801 the country was outright annexed by Russia, and reduced to the status of a Russian region. For the next 117 years, Georgia would be part of the Russian Empire. Russian rule offered the Georgians security from external threats, but it was also often heavy-handed and insensitive to locals. By the late 19th century, discontent with the Russian authorities led to a growing national movement. The Russian imperial period, however, brought unprecedented social and economic change to Georgia, with new social classes emerging. The emancipation of the serfs freed many peasants but did little to alleviate the poverty. The growth of capitalism created an urban working class. In Georgia, both peasants and workers found expression for their discontent through revolts and strikes, culminating in the Revolution of 1905. The cause was championed by the socialist Mensheviks, who became the dominant political force in Georgia in the final years of Russian rule. Georgia finally won its independence in 1918, less as a result of the nationalists' and socialists' efforts, than from the collapse of the Russian Empire in World War I. Background: Russo-Georgian relations before 1801. By the 16th century, the Christian kingdom of Georgia had become fractured into a series of smaller states which were fought over by the two great Muslim empires in the region, Ottoman Turkey and Safavid Persia. But during the second half of the century a third imperial power emerged to the north, namely the Russian state of Muscovy, which shared Georgia's Orthodox religion. Diplomatic contacts between the Georgian kingdom of Kakheti and Moscow began in 1558 and in 1589. Tsar Fyodor II offered to put the kingdom under his protection, yet little help was forthcoming and the Russians were still too remote from the South Caucasus region to challenge Ottoman or Persian control and hegemony successfully. Only in the early 18th century did Russia start to make serious military inroads south of the Caucasus. In 1722, Peter the Great exploited the chaos and turmoil in the Safavid Persian Empire to lead an expedition against it, while he struck an alliance with Vakhtang I, the Georgian ruler of Kartli and the Safavid-appointed governor of the region. However, the two armies failed to link up and the Russians retreated northward again, leaving the Georgians to the mercy of the Persians. Vakhtang ended his days in exile in Russia. Vakhtang's successor, Erikl II, king of Kartli Kakheti from 1762 to 1798, turned towards Russia for protection against Ottoman and Persian attacks. The kings of the other major Georgian state, Imereti, also contacted Russia, seeking protection against the Ottomans. The Russian Empress Catherine the Great was keen to have the Georgians as allies in her wars against the Turks and Persians, but sent only meager forces to help them. In 1769 to 1772, a handful of Russian troops under General Totlaban battled against Turkish invaders in Imereti and Kartli Kakheti. In 1783, Erikl signed the Treaty of Georgisk with Russia, according to which Kartli Kakheti agreed to forswear allegiance to any state except Russia in return for Russian protection. But when another Russo-Turkish war broke out in 1787, the Russians withdrew the troops from the region for use elsewhere, leaving Erikl's kingdom unprotected. In 1795, the new Persian Shah Shah Aga Muhammad Khan issued an ultimatum to Erikal, ordering him to break off relations with Russia or face invasion. Erikal ignored it, counting on Russian help, which did not arrive. Aga Muhammad Khan carried out his threat and captured and burned the capital, Tbilisi, to the ground. The Russian annexations, eastern Georgia, in spite of Russia's failure to honor the terms of the Treaty of Georgisk, Georgian rulers felt they had nowhere else to turn. The Persians had sacked and burned Tbilisi, leaving 20,000 dead. Aga Muhammad Khan, however, was assassinated in 1797 in Shusha, after which the Iranian grip over Georgia softened. Erikal died the following year, leaving the throne to his sickly and ineffectual son Georgi.12. After Georgi's death on 28 December 1800, the kingdom was torn between the claims of two rival heirs, David and Elon. However, Tsar Paul I of Russia had already decided neither candidate would be crowned king. Instead, the monarchy would be abolished and the country administered by Russia. He signed a decree on the incorporation of Kartli into the Russian Empire, which was confirmed by Tsar Alexander I on 12 September 1801. The Georgian envoy in St. Petersburg, Garsevan Jokhadze, reacted with a note of protest that was presented to the Russian Vice-Chancellor Alexander Kurakin. In May 1801, Russian General Karl Heinrich von Noring removed the Georgian heir to the throne, David Batonishvili, from power and deployed a provisional government headed by General Ivan Petrovich Lazarev. Noring had secret orders to remove all the male and some female members of the royal family to Russia. Some of the Georgian nobility did not accept the decree until April 1802, when General Noring held the nobility in Tbilisi's Sioni Cathedral and forced them to take an oath on the imperial crown of Russia. Those who disagreed were arrested. Now that Russia was able to use Georgia as a bridgehead for further expansion south of the Caucasus, Persia and the Ottoman Empire felt threatened. In 1804, Pavel Tsitsionov, the commander of Russian forces in the Caucasus, attacked Ganja, provoking the Russo-Persian War of 1804 to 1813. This was followed by the Russo-Turkish War of 1806 to 12 with the Ottomans, who were unhappy with Russian expansion in western Georgia. Georgian attitudes were mixed. Some fought as volunteers helping the Russian army, others rebelled against Russian rule. Both wars ended in Russian victory, with the Ottomans and Persians recognizing the Tsar's claims over Georgia. Western Georgia. Solomon II of Imereti was angry at the Russian annexation of Kartli. He offered a compromise. He would make Imereti a Russian protectorate if the monarchy and autonomy of his neighbor was restored. Russia made no reply. In 1803, the ruler of Mingrelia, a region belonging to Imereti, rebelled against Solomon and acknowledged Russia as his protector instead. When Solomon refused to make Imereti a Russian protectorate too, the Russian general Tsitsionov invaded, and on 25 April 1804, Solomon signed a treaty making him a Russian vassal. However, Solomon was far from submissive. When war broke out between the Ottomans and Russia, Solomon started secret negotiations with the former. In February 1810, a Russian decree proclaimed that Solomon was dethroned and ordered Imeretians to pledge allegiance to the Tsar. A large Russian army invaded the country, but many Imeretians fled to the forest to start a resistance movement. Solomon hoped that Russia, distracted by its wars with the Ottomans and Persia, would allow Imereti to become autonomous. The Russians eventually crushed the guerrilla uprising, but they could not catch Solomon. However, Russia's peace treaties with Ottoman Turkey and Persia put an end to the king's hopes of foreign support. Solomon died in exile in Trabzon in 1815. In 1828–29, another Russo-Turkish war ended with Russia adding the major port of Poti and the fortress towns of Akhaltsika and Akarkalaki to its possessions. In Georgia, from 1803 to 1878, as a result of numerous Russian wars now against Ottoman Turkey, several of Georgia's previously lost territories, such as Segera, were also incorporated into the empire. The Principality of Guria was abolished and incorporated into the empire in 1829, whilst Vanati was gradually annexed in 1858. Mingralia, although a Russian protectorate since 1803, was not absorbed until 1867. Early years of Russian rule. Integration into the empire. During the first decades of Russian rule, Georgia was placed under military governorship. The land was at the front line of Russia's war against Turkey and Persia, and the commander-in-chief of the Russian army of the region was also the governor. Russia gradually expanded its territory in Transcaucasia at the expense of its rivals, taking large areas of land in the rest of the region, comprising all of modern-day Armenia and Azerbaijan from Kayar, Persia through the Russo-Persian War and the resulting Treaty of Turkmenchay. At the same time, the Russian authorities aimed to integrate Georgia into the rest of their empire. Russian and Georgian society had much in common. The main religion was Orthodox Christianity, and in both countries a land-owning aristocracy ruled over a population of serfs. Initially, Russian rule proved high-handed, arbitrary and insensitive to local law and customs. In 1811, the autocephaly of the Georgian Orthodox Church was abolished. The Catholicos Anton II was deported to Russia and Georgia became an exarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian government also managed to alienate many Georgian nobles, prompting a group of young aristocrats to plot to overthrow Russian rule. They were inspired by events elsewhere in the Russian Empire, the Decembrist revolt in St. Petersburg in 1825 and the Polish uprising against the Russians in 1830. The Georgian nobles' plan was simple. They would invite all the Russian officials in the region to a ball, then murder them. However, the conspiracy was discovered by the authorities on December 10, 1832, and its members were arrested and internally exiled elsewhere in the Russian Empire. There was a revolt by peasants and nobles in Guria in 1841. Things changed with the appointment of Mikhail Semenovich Vorontsov as Viceroy of the Caucasus in 1845. Count Vorontsov's new policies won over the Georgian nobility, who increasingly adopted Western European customs and attire, as the Russian nobility had done in the previous century. Georgian society. When Russian rule began in the early 19th century, Georgia was still a feudal society. At the top had been the royal families of the various Georgian states, but these had been deposed by the Russians and sent into internal exile elsewhere in the empire. Beneath them were the nobles, who constituted about 5% of the population and jealously guarded the power and privileges. They owned most of the land, which was worked by the serfs, unfree peasants who made up the bulk of Georgian society. The rural economy had become seriously depressed during the period of Ottoman and Persian domination, and most Georgian serfs lived in dire poverty, subject to the frequent threat of starvation. Famine would often prompt them to rebellion, such as the major revolt in Kakheti in 1812. Few of them lived in the towns, where what little trade and industry there was in the hands of Armenians, whose ancestors had migrated to Georgia in the Middle Ages. As the century progressed and capitalism came to Georgia, the Armenians would be the first to seize the new opportunities it offered and become a prosperous middle class. Armenian economic dominance in Georgia would mean there was an ethnic element to class tensions in the country. Emancipation of the serfs. Serfdom was a problem not just in Georgia but throughout most of the Russian Empire. By the mid-19th century, the issue of freeing the serfs had become impossible to ignore any longer if Russia was to be reformed and modernized. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom in Russia proper. The Tsar also wanted to emancipate the serfs of Georgia, but without losing the recently earned loyalty of the nobility, whose power and income depended on serf labor. This called for delicate negotiations, and the task of finding a solution that would be acceptable to the landowners was entrusted to the liberal, noble Dmitry Kipiani. On the 13th of October 1865, the Tsar decreed the emancipation of the first serfs in Georgia. The process of abolition throughout all the traditional Georgian lands would last into the 1870s. The serfs became free peasants who could move where they liked, marry whom they chose, and take part in political activity without asking the lord's permission. The nobles retained the title to all the land, but it was to be divided into two parts. The nobles owned one of these parts outright, but the other was to be rented by the peasants who had lived and worked on it for centuries. Over the years, after they had made sufficient payments to compensate the landlords, this land would become their own private property. In the event, the reforms pleased neither nobles nor the ex-serfs. Though they were now free peasants, the ex-serfs were still subject to the heavy financial burden of paying rent, and it usually took decades before they were able to buy the land for themselves. In other words, they were still dependent on the nobles, not legally, but economically. The nobles had accepted the emancipation only with extreme reluctance, and, though they had been more favorably treated than landowners in much of the rest of the empire, they had still lost some of the power and income. In the following years, both peasant and noble discontent would come to be expressed in new political movements in Georgia. Immigration. During the reign of Nicholas II, Russian authorities encouraged the migration of various religious minorities, such as Molokins and Dukobis, from Russia's heartland provinces into Transcaucasia, including Georgia. The intent was both to isolate the troublesome dissenters away from the Orthodox Russians, and to strengthen Russian presence in the region, because Georgia served as more or less a Russian March principality as a base for further expansion against the Ottoman Empire. Other Christian communities from the Transcaucasus region were settled there in the 19th century, particularly Armenians and Caucasus Greeks. These subsequently often fought alongside Russians and Georgians in the Russian Caucasus army in its wars against the Ottomans, helping capture territories in the South Caucasus bordering Georgia that became the Russian militarily administered provinces of Batumi Oblast and Kars Oblast, where tens of thousands of Armenians, Caucasus Greeks, Russians, and other ethnic minority communities living in Georgia were resettled. Cultural and political movements. Incorporation into the Russian Empire changed Georgia's orientation away from the Middle East and towards Europe, as members of the intelligentsia began to read about new ideas from the West. At the same time, Georgia shared many social problems with the rest of Russia, and the Russian political movements that emerged in the 19th century looked to also extend the following in Georgia. Romanticism. In the 1830s, Romanticism began to influence Georgian literature, which enjoyed a revival thanks to famous poets such as Alexander Chavchavadze, Grigol Orbyliani, and, above all, Nikolai Nicholas Baratashvili. They began to explore Georgia's past, seeking a lost golden age which they used as an inspiration for the works. One of Baratashvili's best-known poems, Bedikatlisa, expresses his deep ambivalence about the union with Russia in the phrase, "What pleasure does the nightingale receive from honor if it is in a cage?" Georgia became a theme in Russian literature as well. In 1829, Russia's greatest poet Alexander Pushkin visited the country, and his experience is reflected in several of his lyrics. His younger contemporary, Mikhail Lermontov, was exiled to the Caucasus in 1840. The region appears as a land of exotic adventure in Lermontov's famous novel A Hero of Our Time, and he also celebrated Georgia's wild, mountainous landscape in the long poem Mtsyi, about a novice monk who escapes from the strictness of religious discipline to find freedom in nature. Nationalism in the mid-19th century, Romantic patriotism gave way to a more overtly political national movement in Georgia. This began with a young generation of Georgian students educated at St. Petersburg University, who were nicknamed the Turgdelulnis. The most outstanding figure by far was the writer Ilya Chavchavadze, who was the most influential Georgian nationalist before 1905. He sought to improve the position of Georgians within a system that favored Russian speakers and turned his attention to cultural matters, especially linguistic reform and the study of folklore. Chavchavadze became more and more conservative, seeing it as his task to preserve Georgian traditions and ensure Georgia remained a rural society. The so-called second generation of Georgian nationalists was less conservative than Chavchavadze. They focused more on the growing cities in Georgia, trying to ensure that urban Georgians could compete with the economically dominant Armenians and Russians. The leading figure in this movement was Nika Nikoladze, who was attracted to Western liberal ideas. Nikoladze saw Georgia's future as belonging to a Caucasian federation that would also include Armenia and Azerbaijan. Socialism by the 1870s. Alongside these conservative and liberal nationalist trends, a third, more radical political force had emerged in Georgia. Its members focused on social problems and tended to ally themselves with movements in the rest of Russia. The first stirrings were seen in the attempt to spread Russian populism to the region, though the populists had little practical effect. Socialism, particularly Marxism, proved far more influential in the long run. Industrialization had come to Georgia in the late 19th century, particularly to the towns of Tbilisi, Batumi and Kutaisi. With it had come factories, railways and a new urban working class. In the 1890s, they became the focus of a third generation of Georgian intellectuals who called themselves Social Democrats, and they included Noj Ordania and Philip Makaradze, who had learned about Marxism elsewhere in the Russian Empire. They would become the leading force in Georgian politics from 1905 onwards. They believed that the Tsarist autocracy should be overthrown and replaced by democracy, which would eventually create a socialist society.